Thanks, everyone. We were just chatting here. I want to introduce Wayne Yim. Wayne is a principal with Microsoft in Seattle. Wayne is also obviously an economics alum who graduated in 1997. He did his econ major. He's a Vancouver person, right, who made it down to Seattle and worked for a few different people, but we'd like to have Wayne tell you his story, and we'll go from there. Wayne, go for it.
Hi, yeah, my name is Wayne Yim. I grew up in Vancouver. I went to Van Tech and Churchill in Vancouver, and I've always actually loved Vancouver. Maybe one day, like I'll actually come back and retire there. But for now, like I've been actually working in the Seattle area for almost 20 years now. So we can actually just start here. So here's the outline. I'll talk a bit about my background, what I currently do in my job, like how does econ actually help in my job. Then I'll also talk about trends in the tech industry and any early career advice. So my background, I have a non-standard path into tech. When I actually first graduated out of SFU, I actually spent some time working on a startup where I actually learned a lot of tech skills. And eventually, like I just submitted my resume at that time on monster.com. And eventually, like I actually landed a job at Microsoft, like doing testing, like as a contractor. And then I probably spent a good 2 years just learning different things. And eventually I got a job at Hewlett Packard, like working in data centers and working in tech and things like that. And then eventually I actually joined Microsoft.
Hi,
Yeah.
Wayne, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
We're still on the main slide on your on the screen, so we haven't switched slides at all. So I don't know if you can do that.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Like my point on this slide is like in my career, like I've, like.
Oh no, sorry. We're just still on the initial slide, which just has your name.
Oh, really?
You haven't started your slide share yet.
Oh, okay. Let me share, new share. Does that work?
That's better. Yeah. So now we're on my background. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So like I was mentioning, like I have a non-standard path into tech. In my last 20 years or so of working in tech in the Seattle area, I've worked for Hewlett Packard, Microsoft, Amazon, and back to Microsoft. And when I look back, okay, like I've probably had 9 different sort of like either changes in jobs or different roles within these 3 companies. And I would say in the tech industry, that's quite common. Like I won't go over in detail every single thing I did, but I've done things like being a test engineer, a systems analyst, a systems engineer, developer, program manager. So I'm currently a program manager at Microsoft. Let's move on to the next slide. So what do I do currently? I'm currently a principal program manager in the Office 365 organization. At Microsoft, I've probably spent a total of like 16 and a half years. And within that time, I mentioned I've been a developer also. I've worked on the MSN system. I've worked on Azure. I've worked on Office 365. And within Azure, like I actually helped build the first instance of Azure. In Office 365, I helped turn the like standard Office client-based software into software as a service. So currently I'm actually working in M365 and I'm working on a DaaS. And like for those of you who don't know, like DaaS stands for Data as a Service. It's a very new type of concept in terms of how to treat data. So what do I do? So as a program manager, I essentially drive strategy, design, uh, about the things that we do. So I focus on uh, the what and the why. So what does that mean? The what and the why like essentially means I focus on like what my team should be working on and why they should be doing it. So the how part is actually something that a developer would figure out. Like they would have to figure out like architecture and design to actually meet the what and the why. Uh, so let's see. So yeah, so I focus, and another big thing that I do is prioritize the resources that I have to actually work on a project. So that's actually a big thing. Also, like another key artifact of actually being a program manager is essentially functional specifications. And that's essentially like writing a document and defining what features should be built and like how the success should be measured. So I spend a lot of my time writing those specifications, talking to customers, understanding like what should be built. So what's my typical day like? My typical day, probably, you know, like now it's a little bit different right now just because like everybody at Microsoft is working at home, working from home, but typically within a week, I probably spend a good like 30 to 40% of my time in meetings. And the rest of the time, I would be uh, uh, following up and writing documents and figuring out requirements and also planning for the next things that my team should be working on.
Wayne, I have a quick question for you.
Sure, sure.
So when you talk about writing specifications,
Yeah.
what does that mean?
Sure. Yeah. So the thing is, it could be so let's just say that you're working in a space, right? So like just say, for example, you're working in a space like where you figure out that, hey, I need to create this new widget, right? And then you have to basically write a document that basically says, yes, like we need to create this widget, and this is why we need to do it, right? And then inside the document, you have to be very specific and say, like we need to create 100 widgets. The widgets have to have a length of like 5 centimeters and like a width of 10 centimeters, and the weight has to be 15 grams, and it has to be made out of this material. So it's very specific as to what needs to be built. And then also you have to define what the goals for success are. It could be, we need to actually create 10,000 widgets of this specification, right? Like within a certain time frame, right? So those are the goals for success that are actually part of the requirements phase.
And who identifies what is needed? Is
What
it
is
just
that? Yeah.
a whole
So
team of people and they're reporting to you, or just a specific part of 365 that you're working on?
yeah, so the thing is like in the area that I work on, in the data science engineering space, uh, the program manager actually goes out and figures out what needs to be built. Uh, the purpose of the document is to actually get all those thoughts in a document, and then we basically review that document as a team, right? So it could be my direct team, or it could be we have like say like we could have stakeholders across the company that has a dependency on this thing we want to build, right? So then you would include those folks, and you would basically iterate over the document, and like they would actually give me feedback on the document, you know, like whether it makes sense to build this, what are some different approaches, okay, that we could actually solve this problem, right? So it's a very collaborative process. Like it's not really a sort of top-down approach. It's more of a collaborative consensus building, right? Because typically when you get things built at Microsoft, it's going to require like a lot of different people to buy in, especially if you're actually working on a very large scale project and you're consuming a lot of resources and person power to actually get the project done. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Perfect. Sorry, you can keep going.
Yeah, yeah. Like I was mentioning, like I probably spend a good like 30 to 40% of my time in meetings right now in this COVID situation. Before COVID, I would probably spend maybe 25% of my time in meetings, and the rest of the time I would have a lot of offline conversations with people. Like I would just walk over to somebody's desk and ask them things and things like that. But then now, like since everybody's working from home, you end up having a lot more meetings online. But yeah, you know, like we spend a lot of our time figuring out what the team should be working on and then writing specifications and then creating a plan, like essentially a roadmap of what our team should be working on a quarterly by quarterly basis. Any questions?
If you do have questions, anyone in the group, you can either put it on chat or we can save the questions, the speaker questions at the end.
How economics helps. So I think specifically right now, you know, like some of you actually may have heard the term data is the new oil. And I truly think that's the case. Like data is the new oil. Like everything revolves around data these days, especially in the tech industry. And I would say that's bleeding out to everyday life, right? The use of the internet has actually created an explosion of data, right? And in order to make that data useful, you have to be able to gather insights from those data. And you also have to like, you know, like a lot of businesses now, like they have like massive data teams with data scientists and engineers and things like that, that try to collect the data and essentially create insights from that data. So I think when I look back, when I actually took econ, like I think stats, that was probably the most useful series of classes I've taken, because even today, like I spend a lot of time looking at data and trying to extract insights from it, like using stats. And I also think for econ majors, it would really help to have like really practical data handling skills. So like that means dealing with databases, like knowing languages like SQL, like having experience in programming language like Python and R, but just essentially being able to know how to manage and extract insights from a massive amount of data. I think some career paths for econ majors in tech are data scientists. So like I know many data scientists, like they have econ majors. Quite often they have master's degrees and sometimes they'll have like PhDs. There's also econ majors in online computer gaming. Like a lot of online computer games, like they have entire ecosystems, like where you would have like a player like buy and sell things. Like just say you would have a player, like they would buy like a sword or spear for some currency and they could sell it, and they could actually, or okay, like they could actually maybe like dig gold up like in the game. But those are things, okay, that economists actually focus on. Like there are a lot of companies out there that have people just creating these systems within these online computer gaming worlds. Any questions on this stuff?
And we're going to get into these questions later on, Wayne, but
Yeah.
we do have a quick question here. In terms of technical skills, is R considered equivalent to Python? And what level of programming?
Well, I think it's hard to actually quantify as a level. Like I would say that you should be proficient enough to finish a project end to end. And I think with programming, the proof is in the pudding, because you could actually take a lot of programming courses, but if you can't actually bring something to life that works end to end, then it's hard to say it's valuable. Okay, so it's really about programming. It's about like, can you actually like take like an idea and bring it to life? Like I would say like that's the level of proficiency that you should be at in terms of programming.
Could you elaborate on that process? You said from
Yeah,
what, end to end.
let me,
So
yeah, so
what does that mean?
let me actually give you some concrete examples I can think of. Okay, so like just say, for example, you needed to actually create a system that could actually take the logs from, say, the daily sales of Amazon. Okay, like just say you had access to all that data, right? Like, how could you write code that can extract that data and build a report that tells you most the top 10 sales for each region of the world, right? So first, okay, you would have to know how to extract the data from some web service somewhere, and then you would have to deal like with like potentially, like millions, if not billions, of rows of data, and then like generate a report. So the level of like skill that you would need to do that, like it's not just about like taking like a programming course. You have to be able to take the concepts uh, from those courses and actually produce something end to end that works. Does that explain it?
Yeah, absolutely. But part of that process, Wayne, because my goal as a moderator as well is to present students with a set of skills that you have. So a lot of the skills that you have, Wayne, are implied. So when you're in meetings, um, you know, there's an implied level of communication. If we could talk about communication for a quick second before, aside from the technical skills, what type of communication are you involved in? Obviously, you're dealing in meetings, face to face, whether it's on Zoom. What about writing and report writing? How does that play in a role in your day to day?
Yeah, like I would say that probably like my biggest asset, like at least to me, is actually writing skills. And in the tech industry, like you may not think like that writing skills are actually very important, but it is actually very critical. And at some companies, say Amazon, if you want anybody to do anything for you, like you have to write a document. And they have like different like grades of documents. They'll like have something called the 6-pager, right? Like you have the 6-pager. You essentially like need to write like a 6-pager to describe like what you want like some exec to support. Or if you are a manager and you wanted to get somebody promoted, you could end up writing like a 15-20 pager document on somebody that works for you that you think needs to be promoted. And then also, even at Microsoft, doc writing is also like a very critical skill. Also, like when you're at meetings, and there's different ways to run this, but I would say communicating your ideas to the people that you work with is critical. Because if you can't get your idea across, it's actually very hard to convince others to work on your project. Because as I mentioned, that a lot of things at Microsoft are not like, they're not sort of top down things. Okay, like a lot of it has to happen through consensus building, and how you communicate either verbally or within a document is actually critical to be successful.
And are straight programmers or straight developers also required to have writing skills, whether it's memo writing, short form, and more of that long term that you were just speaking about?
I would say like even developers is actually very important, because like I didn't mention this, okay, but program managers will actually write a functional specification of the things that should be built, and then uh, what are the features and timelines that are involved in building this stuff. But the other part that the developer has to write is a design specification. So and the design specification like takes the requirements from the functional specification, and it talks about how it should be built. So it could be that, oh, okay, in order to actually meet this goal in the functional spec, that it can only, like this service that we want built, it can only be down, let's just say 40 minutes every year, right? So like that is like a very high uptime for a service. You need to have like, say, 3 or 4 nines of uptime. Then, okay, like that means your design has to be able to support that. And inside the design, they could say, okay, yeah, we have to have like multiple front-end web servers across different regions of the world. And then we need to have a back-end servers that are redundant. And so it's all tied together, right? So then even as a developer, like having good writing skills is important. And I would say the more senior you get as a developer, the more critical your writing skills are, right? Because like quite often, like if you're a very senior developer or architect, you will end up writing these very, like large white papers about like how something should be done. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, perfect. No, perfect. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about the tech industry. I think the way I currently see it, in my opinion, like there's actually a few areas in the computing space that is impacting the world right now. Like the first is cloud computing, and cloud computing uh, that's been happening for the last like 15 years, but it's essentially uh, moving away from the desktop and actually putting that computing power in the cloud, right? So a lot of services that people use today, like say Netflix, just say for example, Netflix doesn't actually have their own servers like sitting in some data center. Like they actually use AWS, which is Amazon. They basically rent that compute and storage power from other companies. So that's about cloud computing. That's been happening for the last like 15 years. Um, AI is also like a massive thing, right? I mean, artificial intelligence, right? And data actually powers AI. Like I would say every major tech company right now is focused on like how they can actually excel in AI. And the other thing, like I'll skip over big data, like I'll talk about that last, but IoT. So IoT is the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is essentially all these gadgets and things like that that you have connected to the internet. There's more and more of them. Like you can get like a toaster that's connected to the internet, or a microwave that has Alexa in it. So um, that's only going to accelerate. There's going to be more and more things that are connected to the internet, and all of these things that are connected to the internet is just going to generate a massive amount of data, right? And that's where big data comes in. Uh, all these other areas like cloud computing, AI, IoT, they will all generate a massive amount of data. And that data is in turn used to power the AI that companies want to create. So I think that people in the econ space, like there's a big opportunity like to work in that area of big data to like essentially gather insights from that data. The other thing I want to point out is the acceleration of tech trends like due to COVID. Like so, uh, everyone at work now is like essentially working from home right now, and like a lot of trends like remote working, you know, big data, AI, all that stuff. Like I would say it's being accelerated, and in my opinion, at least by 5+ years. Like if COVID didn't happen, like I don't think things like remote working would be as readily accepted as it's now. So I think because of it, it's actually accelerating. Any comments about this stuff?
Wayne, I have a quick question. Because of COVID, and you're saying it's accelerated by 5 years plus, and I tend to agree. Are there specific areas that you think are just trending in a very big way? I mean, you've mentioned AI, big data, and cloud computing, but is there any specific areas that you're going to see a more rush of people getting into technology-wise, either through Microsoft
Yeah.
or Amazon?
Yeah, like definitely, you know, like I would say cloud computing, like that's almost like table stakes now because it's been going on for the last like 15 years. Um, and I also mentioned the IoT stuff, right? There's going to be more and more things that are connected to the internet, and it's going to generate a massive amount of data, right? So I think like since cloud computing and IoT are just, you know, like it's only going to be more common, like it's going to generate more data, and there's going to be a bigger need for people that understand how to manage and gather insights from that data, and those insights get also power AI. So I think like AI and big data, like those are massive areas. And I mentioned I thought that the data is the new oil, and I really think that's the case, right? Because like data uh, powers a lot of these things. It powers AI, like it comes from big data and being able to gather insights from that data.
Thanks very much. We have a question here. For showcasing communication skill, what do you think about uploading research papers on a LinkedIn profile or a writing sample to employers? Would that backfire if the paper is quite technical?
Oh, it's interesting you mentioned that because like some companies, right? Like just say with Amazon, right? Like if you're interviewing for a job, like like in some of the more senior roles, like they will ask you to write a paper, and it's not just Amazon. There's other companies that do that. There's other tech companies that do that. Like as part of the interview process, that they'll actually to ask you to write a document. So I think like it doesn't hurt to upload your document or uh, advertise it on LinkedIn. It definitely doesn't hurt.
So just to give you an example, Wayne, so the portfolio of students that are with us, and also we'll have a number of students who will watch this on YouTube. They'll range from literally students who are just in their first year to actually PhD students. I'm not sure if you're going to cover recruiting later, but maybe we can open that discussion now. In terms of that next step for students who are graduating, whether they're graduating from their undergrad or they're in their last year, what types of things would you recommend that they start doing in terms of trying to start accessing these big companies like Microsoft, Amazon, etc.?
I think okay that you have to actually make your resume. You know, like a lot of like schools, they actually have partnerships with the various tech companies out there, and there's actually like a pipeline to actually get like new grads like into these tech companies. Like I think the big difference is the big thing that will help like new grads is essentially like having some like something in their resume that makes them stand out. It could be like a project that they've done outside of school that showcases their practical skills, because like there's going to be like a lot of people that apply to these tech companies. Uh, uh, if you actually went publicly like to these companies through their website and you submitted like your resume through their website, it's actually very hard to get noticed, right? Because like every day like they'll get thousands and thousands of resumes. So I think it's important to actually try and showcase something that makes you stand out. Does
I'm
that help?
just, yeah, it does help. I mean, I have 10 more questions, but I'll refer to this next one from a student. Would you recommend something for first and second year students to start doing right now?
Well, try to actually, yeah, like I think, okay, like so if you're interested in the tech space, like a lot of it is can can be actually done by yourself, like working on projects that, like even outside of school, like that can showcase your talents and initiative. Uh, it could be like writing an application, or creating a website. Uh, like in the econ space, like maybe okay, you can showcase your skills like analyzing data. One example is like I think I read an article recently in the COVID uh, like situation. There was a student that actually created like a website on COVID, and he was analyzing the data that came out of it. Like I mean, like those are things that you could easily sort of do on your own, and it helps you stand out.
We have another question here, Wayne. What's your view on the tech scene, data science scene in Vancouver?
In Vancouver, honestly, so uh, definitely like there's a lot more tech jobs. Like I think in the last few years, definitely like when I graduated, like there wasn't much of a tech scene in Vancouver. Uh, I think the last few years, like there is more tech jobs because there's a lot more tech companies that have opened up branches in Vancouver, like whether it's Amazon or Microsoft. Like there's quite a few up there now, uh, and I probably think that's going to accelerate. And the reason why is because first, like the U.S. In the last few years has been a lot more like strict in terms of worker visa, so it's a lot harder to actually hire foreign workers into the United States. And then also this whole COVID thing basically shows us like that you could actually do pretty much everything you need to do remotely, like using, like whether it's Zoom or Teams and just working online. That like I think that's just gonna result in more companies like hiring people, not just locally, but in different countries. I think that's going to be more common.
I'm going to ask you a general. Do you have another slide, Wayne, that we wanted to get to first before?
Yeah, this is
There we
just
go.
the last slide here.
Okay.
I think for this one, so early career advice, so like I put like build marketable and transferable skills. I think like that that goes to my point of trying to take the initiative and actually learn things and uh, uh, by yourself. It doesn't have to be directly related to your coursework, but you can take the concepts that you learned at school and then you can apply them in the real world. And it could be a project, like I just mentioned, like I read some article about some guy just created some website about COVID and he gathered all the data, and he basically built some insights around that data. I mean, those are things you could do on your own. Those types of skills are very transferable. And then also, I think your career is a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? Like uh, once you graduate, like most likely like you'll be working for quite a while. So like it's okay to actually, like take the time to learn things and build your skill set. And then also uh, always be learning. I think in the tech space, like it's actually not simply like a job. Like like you have to be constantly learning. At the start of the presentation, like I mentioned, like I have probably had like 9 different roles like in my career, and every one of those times, like I had to learn something new, and that's normal in tech. And then like that's the mindset that you have to have uh, to make sure that you have a long career.
That's great. Thanks, Wayne.
Yeah.
What we'll do right now is we'll just open it up to questions. So I'm going to reiterate again, everyone. Um, you have an opportunity here to speak to someone who is embedded in Microsoft and has been for a long time, and in the whole tech scene in Seattle. I have a ton of questions, of course, and I'm going to make sure I get those in. But if you have questions, we can open up your mic or you can type it in the chat. Okay, we have one right here. Okay, yes. How does your economics major come into the tech industry? So how does it come into play?
Yeah, like I've actually done, like I mentioned, like I've done like nine different things in my career, and probably the first 10 years of it, like I was basically a developer. But I would say in my last couple of years, like working in the data science space, the data science engineering space, like I would say like that was the time where my economics degree actually made a difference, I think, okay, because I'm always trying to gather insights from the data, right? Like I mentioned, like stats was probably the most useful classes that I've actually taken because I'm constantly referring to how to gather insights. And then also, like a lot of and also like another thing is that when I was taking stats like back in school, like a lot of it was very theory based, like, okay, like if you needed to calculate the percentiles of something, right? Like like you learn how to do that, okay, but the thing is you have to be able to actually take that theory and apply it in the real world, right? So okay, this is how you calculate uh, the the values, but how can you apply that to a data set that could be, I don't know, like 10 million rows of data, and you need to do that every day, right? So that's where the practical skill comes in. So I think like combined like with the theory, like you need to actually have the practical skill. And that's where you actually like learn some programming language that can allow you to apply the theory.
I'm going to insert some of my questions in between other people's
Yeah.
questions, if you don't mind. So just from the building blocks, Wayne, we have students who, obviously would like to access companies like Microsoft and others. What's their first step? I mean, you had mentioned you can go through the public website and apply for a job, but to get noticed amongst the thousands of resumes is difficult. Is there anything else you would suggest, whether it's networking? I know that there's a couple of students, I think, who are in this group right now, or who will be viewing this on YouTube, who've gone to these different conferences like NABE, that has, the big players, and they recruit. What would you suggest to try and just get into that sphere so you can get noticed to hopefully get recruited? Suggestions?
Um, that's a very good question. So like this is like quite a long time ago, but I think like definitely like you have to have some skills that will stand out amongst your peers. Uh, I think obviously, like if you want to actually get like a job like straight out of college, like into a big tech company, you know, like the big ones, like where there's like Google, Facebook, all that stuff like that, Microsoft, Amazon, like grades are going to be like a big factor. Uh, but outside the grades, like you have to be able to demonstrate that you have some initiative, right? And uh, highlight like some things that you've actually done outside of school. Like I think that would actually make a big difference, right? You could actually create, you know, like I mentioned some examples previously, but a lot of, you know, there's definitely like a lot of competition, like whether you go publicly or whether they're okay, like the company actually has a hiring process like through your school, like it's going to be very competitive, right? So you're going to have to stand out and actually present some skills that let you uh, stand out amongst your peers.
At the beginning, you had mentioned some
Yeah.
skill sets. In a previous slide, you had mentioned SQL. You had mentioned, some R or Python. What are some skill sets that are just a vernacular, like you just have to have before you would even, if you even want to look at any sort of job? And again, these jobs are not going to be maybe just developer jobs. Maybe they're going to be jobs in different areas of Microsoft. But what skill sets would you think students have to have, for
Yeah,
sure?
like I would say like just say for like actual data science jobs, from what I've seen, like typically like they will have a graduate degree. And even like at gaming companies where you're a economist, like working on games and things like that, they're typically going to have a graduate degree, like if not a PhD. Uh, yeah. So
So
and
graduate degree, you mean like a master's
right.
in economics, PhD
Yes.
in
Yes.
economics?
Yes. Yes. Uh, as for like hard skills and things like that, you know, like the ones that I mentioned, you know, like if you want to play in the big data space, because there's actually like a gap right now, like I can see between economics majors and a data scientist. Uh, the ones that I see that actually end up getting jobs at a big tech company are like ones that they they do have that skill set that allows them to actually take their theory and actually apply it to the real world, right? So that means like actually knowing Python, like knowing R, like knowing SQL. Um, and not only that, right? Like in the tech space, like there's actually a lot of like sort of Python libraries that are already pre-built in the open source community that allows data scientists to gather insights from data, right? So just say, for example, like I have a colleague, like she leveraged a third party, well, like an open source stats library to actually gather insights like from some usage data. Uh, and those are things that people could learn, like even outside of what they learned at school. Uh, yeah, so like I noticed like there's a gap between like the theory part and the actual application of their skill set. So I think that's the gap, and I think probably like it would be good for schools to actually have more practical programs that address that gap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I'll just get to a couple of questions here.
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing your comparison of your experience at Microsoft and Amazon?
Yeah, like I think that there's a lot of differences and there, but at the same time there's a lot of similarities actually. Uh, and the reason why I say that is because like there's a lot of sort of movement between the two companies, right? Like there's a lot of people that used to work at Microsoft and they go to Amazon, or you have some people that used to work at Amazon that go to Microsoft, and then like there's people that go back and forth. Like I was one of those people, and I think there's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas. But some differences is that I would say Amazon, I mentioned like that they actually write a lot of documents, right? So at Amazon, like you have to write a lot of documents to get your ideas across. Microsoft is not quite as structured like that. Like different teams will have different policies of like what needs to be docked and things like that. But yeah, and then also I would say Amazon, like they try to foster more of a startup culture. Yeah, like I wouldn't say, like I'm not saying like one is better than the other. Like there are some differences, but then at the same time, like there's actually a lot of similarities because the workforce, right? Like a lot of them have actually come from each other's companies, so the backgrounds like tend to be quite similar, right? And then also like I would say the tech scene in Seattle is actually quite specific. The tech scene in Seattle, like there's like a massive like cloud computing base in the Seattle area, just because Amazon is based here and Microsoft is based here, and they all have really like huge like cloud computing arms, right? Like Azure and AWS, like those are massive cloud computing platforms. Whereas in the Bay Area, like you have a lot more sort of consumer-focused tech companies, right? Whether it's like Facebook or like Google. Yeah, there's differences there.
I have another question here. How do I gain more knowledge about data analyzing? If someone wants to go to data sciences, would a joint major with economics and business administration not be very helpful?
Mm, hmm. I think okay, like there are some schools that have like a dedicated data science programs, but I don't think they're very common. Uh, but I think like it doesn't hurt, right? So like it depends on where you want to focus on. Like if you actually wanted to focus more on being a data scientist, like I think like a more appropriate could be econ and computer science. Like that might be more better. Uh, econ and business, like I would say, like if you want to be more on the business side of things, then that could work. But if you want to focus like more on the sort of data scientist side of things, yeah, like I would think like to have like a double major in computer science, that might be more appropriate.
When you emphasize, I mean, one of your themes here today is, outside sort of project-based types of things, right? And is there, this is a bit of a tough question, but is there anything that you would uh, suggest? I mean, some students just don't. I mean, can it be as little as a a a small project? Getting some data, analyzing it. Coming up with some models or some conclusions. What would you? Anything that you'd like to suggest to students right now?
Hmm. Well, like there's actually like a lot of like so like there's a large open source community in the world right now, like for developers at least, right? And then there's no reason why you couldn't actually like write some Python code uh, to analyze a bunch of data. And it could, like I'm just making something up. It could be like COVID impact on sales of goods in Vancouver, right? Goods and services, right? And then you could actually just upload that like into like a, a, a you could upload that into GitHub, which is an open source place like where code and things are stored. You could upload that, and that could be like part of your resume.
Could you repeat that? What is it? GitHub?
GitHub, it's a GITHUB. So like there's like a huge sort of like army of sort of like open source developers that writes code, and they just openly publish it on the internet for people to use and improve. And yeah, like I don't see a reason why, like as a student, you couldn't actually like upload like your ideas to those places, and it's actually probably shows like a recruiter that you're actually trying to apply like what you've learned.
Here's another question for you, Wayne. Thanks for that. What kind of soft skills mindsets do you think help carry your career progression as far as promotions go? Rising through the corporate ladder or dealing with the politics, stress, and criticism amongst your management supervisors? That's a great question.
Like I think that probably like one of the most common things that I see at all the companies that I've worked at and different roles that I've worked at is like that you have to have a growth mindset, and you also have to be accepting of feedback, right? Because that feedback actually helps you grow. I think that, and then conversely, if you're giving feedback to somebody else, like there's always a sort of constructive way to give feedback, and so that it doesn't actually come out as just criticism, right? Like so, like I think there's like a difference between like being a critic or like like vs like being somebody that's going to give you constructive feedback, and feedback that's good like that, like it can help you grow. And I think like that's a critical aspect of actually just growing in your career.
I've got another question here for you, Wayne. For showcasing technical skills, would you encourage us to show a project, in brackets, an end-to-end product like a web application, even though the code is written in a rather brute force manner?
Yeah, like I think okay that there's probably a time and place for like very intricate, well commented, and like well created code. And there's places like where like you like need to just sort of highlight your skills and get something bootstrapped, right? Like I think that the the latter is probably more important. Like if you're just starting out, like just getting something working is probably more useful than actually writing code that's like super efficient, because you're trying to highlight more of like uh, your ability to actually build something that works and is practical. Does that does that make sense?
That absolutely makes sense.
Yeah.
It, Wayne, just in terms of the student who's, because I know what perspective a lot of these students are coming from, which is they've got their CCon degree, and they just want to build up skills in a portfolio that'll be attractive to employers. And one thing you did mention was graduate work. So I know we have a PhD in the audience. We have some students who are probably thinking graduate school, but we also have students who are just saying, "Hey, listen, I've got my econ degree. I don't know code so well. Maybe I'll just do a boot camp." What do you think about these boot camps in Vancouver, for example, in Gastown? That you have those 6-week Python, and if you do recommend it, are there any specifics that you think that students should learn?
Yeah, like I don't know about the boot camps in Vancouver, but they also have them here too. But I don't know, like I think as long as you go in with the right expectations, like I think they could be useful. because it'll force you to actually learn a bunch of tech skills that may take you much longer to learn either on your own or through like a standard course. But I think it's important to actually go in with the right expectations, because like I always hear like ads once in a while that like on the radio, like when I'm driving to work or something like that, like they'll say, hey, like take this boot camp and then like you'll land a job at company X, Y, and Z. I think you should probably take that with a grain of salt and like set the right expectations, right? Like I think like that taking a 6-week boot camp and expecting that you're going to land a job at some big tech company that's going to pay you like a ton of money, like I think that's unrealistic.
So that would be more of a skill build, get the skill build, and then just sort of move from there.
Yeah.
You didn't address networking, Wayne.
Yeah, definitely. Like I would say networking is actually like a massive part of your career. Like if you want to have a long career, and the networking becomes more and more important, like the more senior that you get in your career. So like the higher up you go, like the more important it is to actually have the right contacts. Like going from like Microsoft to Amazon or Google or Facebook, like it's going to help immensely. Like if you actually know people within those companies, right? Because as I mentioned, right, like if you just submit your resume publicly, like you are like literally like a drop in a sea of resumes. And like one question might be like, how do you actually build that network? And I would say a lot of it has to do with like you building relationships as you're actually working, right? Like making sure you have a good relationship with your coworkers, making sure that you build a solid reputation of getting things done, things like that. Like that's going to help you in the long run, because as you actually progress in your career, like you're going to have a greater dependency on your network, because typically at a lot of these companies, like if you want to have a very senior role, like most companies are not just going to like blindly hire you just on what you have in your resume. Like they're going to be impacted by your references, like who do they know that can vouch for you, right? And then how you actually build that support network is actually building your relationships over time. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Can you speak to Wayne, to LinkedIn?
LinkedIn. Yeah, like I would, so like when I actually first looked for a job, like almost 20 years ago, like LinkedIn didn't exist, and like monster.com was the thing back then, I remember. But I would say right now, like Monster is not even there. Like LinkedIn is probably like the place like most people use these days to look for jobs. Uh, yeah, and the thing is, another thing about LinkedIn is they actually have a feature for references, right? So like as you are actually working in your career, right? Like a lot of people will actually build up the references like right in LinkedIn, right? You basically send a request to a peer or colleague that you worked with before, and then you can actually write a reference for that person, and it's stored there. It's a lot easier than actually trying to, contact somebody that you worked with like 10 years ago and ask them for a reference, right? It's much tougher.
Absolutely. I have another question here. If you emphasize that it is important to have technical skills, but would you say it's also important to know how to analyze and gain insights from that data, comparing an econ student with programming skills versus a pure computing science student? Good question, Carmen.
Yeah, like I would say the difference between a data scientist and a developer is that the data scientist is actually focused on gathering those insights, like getting those insights from the data. But then at the same time, if you don't have any like sort of practical skills, okay, to extract that data, then you won't be able to build those insights. Does that make sense, right? Because, like quite often, like you'll be dealing with a massive data set. And the thing is like, how are you going to extract that insight from like a data set that could be, I don't know, like 100 million rows of data, right? You're not going to be able to use Excel because Excel, like it doesn't handle anything over a million rows. Well, okay, so you have to have some practical skill there, and like I would say that is the essential gap, but the gap between like a data scientist or data analyst like vs a developer, right? The developer is not really focused on the insights. Like they're actually focused on actually building systems that could provide access to the data, right? So like in the environment that I work in, like I work with like data scientists and uh, uh, developers, and the devs in our team like essentially like build like a data platform so that the data analysts or data scientists can actually gather those insights in a repeatable way that's at scale, right? Because as I mentioned, okay, like a lot of these online services, like when you're using Facebook or using Google search or whether you're using Office like 365, you're going to generate like, billions of rows of data every single day, billions, right? So you need to have like a system that can not only collect that data and store that data, but you also have to be able to query that data. And the standard like tool sets that somebody uses, like Excel and things like that, like it's not going to be able to allow you to extract those insights. So that is where those practical skills come out. Does that answer your question?
Could you say, Wayne, that with economics and having a background in economics, it actually helps you? And this is what I've heard when I did my degree. It allows you to analyze data sets, actually use some code, and then it helps to explain the story. Like you can actually tell the story behind that data set. Would you agree, or would you amend that?
Yeah, like I like agree with that. And then, like I was talking about like how I spend a lot of time like writing functional specifications. Like one of the key things of actually coming up with a functional specification is like, how do you know that you're successful? How do you know like what's being built meets the criteria, right? So
Good
that
point.
criteria has to be measurable, right? So it means you have to create like some metrics that say whatever your team is working on is actually meeting the bar, right? So this is like where understanding like how to measure something and how to track its progress actually makes a difference, right? Yeah. Does that make sense? Like I could probably get a little more concrete,
Yeah.
but like just say for example, okay, like if you are working on a system, like you need your team to actually like work on the performance of a system, okay? Like when you actually use your phone, uh, there's an application uh, that runs in that phone, and then you actually need, and let's just say, okay, like that you use like the voice assistant that comes with your phone, and it interacts with that application, right? And you actually have that application, like let's just say like you can ask it for your schedule for today, and it spits out your schedule for today. It basically talks to you and it tells you that, right? And then you as the program manager for that application, part of your success criteria is like, how do you measure what is good performance from the perspective of the user? Like, how do you know that, right? And you could come up with some metrics. You could say, oh, I expect a response from the application on my phone when I talk to it. I expect it to happen within 100 milliseconds, let's just say. I'm just making something up, right? So the thing is like, you as the program manager would have to say, okay, how do you measure that? Like, okay, 100 milliseconds, like, what does that mean? Okay, like, is that 100 milliseconds average? Is that 100 milliseconds at the 50th percentile? Is that 100 milliseconds at the 99th percentile? So those are things that I think make a difference, right? Having an econ background will actually make a difference because you can come up with those numbers, right? And the reasoning for them. Does that make sense?
Oh, and absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, do we have any other questions out there from the audience? You can go specific. You can ask more general questions as well. I have a couple more general questions, but I'll wait for some students if they have any. So we're close to wrapping this up, Wayne. But before we go, just in terms of general strategy for students. Now, I connected with you through LinkedIn, so I have to emphasize to students we have a Simon Fraser Economics LinkedIn group, which I hope everyone here is a part of. Which is key, has been key for me to stay in touch with alumni. Now, you're someone that I just connected with a couple of months ago, and you graduated in actually 1997. So I encourage students to do that. For our group of students here, how would you expect in terms of protocol that they interact with people on LinkedIn, such as yourself?
Protocol.
You know, we don't want people bugging you like, or, messaging you all the time. Can they actually uh, touch
Like I
base with you?
think, yeah, I think like having like a group within LinkedIn could work, or like even like a distribution alias, right? Like I don't, yeah. So like you would basically like have a distribution alias, and like people could ask questions. Sort of getting like message directly on LinkedIn like could be quite overwhelming. Uh, but if there was like sort of a discussion group, like that could work.
So, from my perspective, anyone who does have questions for Wayne, they can certainly direct them through me, and I'd be happy to connect with Wayne in the future, and I hope to connect with you in the future as well, Wayne. Any last parting words, Wayne, before we wrap this up for students um, when they start their journey, or while they're in the midst of their academic journey in terms of
Yeah, like as I mentioned previously, like I think there's actually like a massive opportunity for economics majors in the data space. The data science space is like a burgeoning field. Like it's something that did not exist like when I graduated from school. So I think that if you can actually build some practical programming skills that allow you to actually analyze data, that would make a difference. And then maybe something that the schools could actually think about is actually designing a program like around practical uh, uh, skills that would allow like a student to like apply their theory. Like that would make a big difference.
Quick question before we go. Can you speak about behavioral economics in tech firm, especially on experimentation?
Yeah. So like I would say behavior is like probably a very critical area because you have to be, so like there's actually a lot of people that actually focus on the usage of a product, right? It could be how somebody is using Office, a product, like how somebody using Word, or how somebody's using like Facebook, or how they're using search, and like basically looking at the data like of how somebody uses something and then gathering insights from that. It could be, oh, okay, like when somebody uses this word feature, they might actually be open to using this other feature in another product somewhere. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's people's behaviors while they either are engaged in a program, or reactions when they're actually in a particular program. Yeah, I think behavioral economics is gaining more and more momentum. I hear that Google especially is expanding that area quite rapidly.